Victorian Britain is known for many things, but it's certainly not remembered for its quality police work. Though Victorian punishments were severe, police forces were only in their infancy and few crimes were solved and brought to justice in any way that resembled what we would call good detective work. For fans of true crime, this era provides no shortage of unsolved murders to puzzle over centuries later. This was, of course, the time of Jack the Ripper, the Thames Torso murders, and Émile Langelier. But unsolved murders weren't limited to the dark, seedy streets of big cities. One of the era's most intriguing unsolved killings occurred in the Priory, a sprawling Gothic-style villa in Barham, a quiet hamlet famed for its large homes and impressive gardens. It was there that Charles Bravo took his final breaths after a horrific poisoning. Though the case captured the nation's attention and sparked 2 official inquests, it remains unsolved. On April the 18th, 1876, 30-year-old Charles Delauny Turner Bravo retired to the spare room for the night after exchanging heated words with his wife of 4 months, Florence. Minutes later, he threw open the door and shouted for hot water. 3 days later, he was dead from antimony poisoning. Was he killed by a vengeful servant, a jealous ex-lover, or his own wife? It was no secret that Charles' marriage to Florence was not one of love, but of convenience. Florence's reputation was in tatters, but she had plenty of money. And Charles, a barrister, was short on cash, but had no shortage of respectability. A union would, in theory, solve all their problems. Florence had married once before at the age of 19 to a dashing officer named Alexander Ricardo. The newspapers hailed the marriage as the union of 2 great families of Europe. The Ricardos were descendants of a prominent Dutch Jewish family, while Florence Campbell's father, an Australian millionaire, owned the impressive Buscott Park estate in Oxfordshire. Alexander revealed himself to be a philanderer and alcoholic and was frequently verbally and physically abusive to Florence. In 1869, she wrote to her parents expressing her desire to separate from her husband. Her mental health was in a shambles and she was often physically ill from the constant stress. Fearing the social backlash of separation, the Campbells advised Florence to seek help from Dr. James Gully, a homeopathic hydrotherapist who ran a renowned practice in the spa town of Malvern. Gully, who treated celebrity patients like Charles Dickens and Alfred Tennyson, was a family friend of the Campbells, and they were sure he could cure their daughter. Instead, he advised Florence to separate from Ricardo, who was destroying her health and well-being. The doctor helped her prepare the legal paperwork for a formal separation, despite her father's threats of cutting her off financially. In March 1871, Alexander Ricardo made a final attempt to reconcile with Florence weeks before the separation was finalized. When she refused, Ricardo fled abroad. On April the 20th, Florence received a telegram informing her that her soon-to-be ex-husband had been found dead in Cologne, Germany. Because he had failed to update his will, she would inherit his entire £40,000 fortune. Now independently wealthy, Florence was able to lease a large mansion in Balham called the Priory, where she kept a stable of horses and a large garden. She spent much time with her newly retired neighbour, Dr. Gully. The pair were often seen shopping, dining and riding together. But in May of 1872, their relationship was revealed to be more than mere friendship, when the host of a house party returned from a walk to find the pair in a compromising position on the parlour sofa. For an unmarried woman to engage in a physical relationship was unthinkable amongst the upper classes in Victorian England. But that was just the beginning of the scandalous nature of the salacious affair. Dr. James Gully was nearly 40 years older than Florence. He was also married. The pair had grown close when Gully treated Florence in Malvern and helped her through her separation. He was said to be a kind gentleman, different in every way from her brutish former husband. He'd been her champion, guiding her to freedom when everyone else in her life was telling her to stay put in an abusive marriage. The pair wanted to wed, but the good doctor was unable to separate from his wife, who had been institutionalized for many years. So instead, he had given up his practice and relocated to Balham so he and Florence could carry on their love affair. When word spread of Florence's elderly married lover, her reputation was effectively ruined. Those who had once been her friends now refused to acknowledge her on the street. Her parents barred her from visiting Buscott Park and refused to see her at the Priory. Though heartbroken by her seclusion from her family and society, her love of Dr. Gully may have been enough to sustain her, if not for what happened next. After a romantic trip to a spa town in rural Bavaria, Florence discovered she was pregnant. Knowing that an illegitimate child would destroy her future entirely, she allowed Gully to perform an abortion, which left her seriously ill. As she recovered at the Priory, she was tended to by her lady's companion, Jane Cox. Jane was also a widow, recently returning to England from Jamaica with 3 young sons. Florence initially hired Jane to oversee her household staff, but the pair quickly developed a close friendship. Jane worried for her and was desperately uneasy about her relationship with Gully. Though Florence had all the material wealth she could want, she was lonely. Without a husband, she would never have children. Without the right husband, she would never be able to re-enter society. So, in 1874, Cox arranged a series of meetings between Florence and the stepson of a business associate of Jane's late husband, Mr. Charles Bravo. Charles was well educated and well connected, and despite his family's wealth as a stepson, he relied on handouts, which were growing wearisome. He proposed to Florence in October of 1875, and she accepted, seeing the marriage as a pathway to restoring her place in society. Before they wed, she confessed her affair with Dr. Gully to Bravo. In return, he told Florence of an illegitimate daughter he'd fathered with a mistress in Maidenhead. They both agreed to end these relationships immediately and never mention them again. For Charles, the marriage was a means to acquiring Florence's fortune, so he was shocked when she informed him before their wedding that she intended to use the newly enacted Married Women's Property Act to retain control over her finances. Infuriated, Charles threatened to call off the wedding. Though she'd ended her relationship with Dr. Gully, she secretly sought his advice. He told her to allow Charles ownership of the house and everything in it, while maintaining sole ownership of the capital. Charles agreed to the compromise, and the two wed on December the 7th, 1875. Her reputation was restored, and Florence reunited with her family and hosted lavish parties. But as her social standing improved, her new marriage withered. Charles was critical of his new wife's spending and wanted to reduce the household staff. Shortly before their wedding, he'd fired Florence's coachman of 4 years, George Griffiths. He was also jealously obsessed with Dr. Gully, who still lived nearby. In December and January, Charles received 3 anonymous letters accusing him of marrying Florence only for her money. He was convinced the notes were from Gully and became fixated on ensuring neither his wife nor anyone else in the household had any interaction with the doctor. To add to the pair's woes, Florence suffered 2 miscarriages in the space of 4 months and became weak and depressed. Most days, she was entirely bedridden, attended faithfully by Jane Cox. Her relationship with Charles was strained, with some accounts claiming Bravo physically, verbally and sexually abused her. Charles was particularly critical of his wife's fondness for alcohol, which she clung to for relief from her despair and pain. On the night of April the 18th, 1876, the pair exchanged heated words when Charles saw a maid bringing wine to her room. Bravo was in a foul mood that day, having suffered a fall from a horse that left him with back pain. He was also suffering from a toothache and had received a scathing letter from his stepfather. After scolding Florence, he slammed the spare room door closed. Soon after, he burst from the room shouting for Florence to bring him hot water. The maid alerted Jane Cox, who ran to the spare room to find Charles vomiting out the window. As Jane tended to Charles, the maid woke Florence, who sent for a doctor. Over the next few days, Charles Bravo was attended by 6 doctors, including his cousin, Royce Bell, and the royal physician, Sir William Gull. Each doctor attempted to discover which substance Charles had imbibed that made him so ill. Jane Cox told the physicians that Charles had told her, "I have taken some of that poison, don't tell Florence." But to the doctors, Charles insisted he'd only taken a small amount of laudanum to ease his toothache. At 5:20 a.m. on April the 21st, Charles Bravo was pronounced dead. A coroner's inquest into his death was launched just days later. The post-mortem found that Charles had ingested 30 to 40 grams of tartar emetic, a derivative of antimony that burns the organs and causes a terribly painful death. The inquest concluded in an open verdict stating that there was not sufficient evidence to rule the death as either a suicide or a homicide. Charles Bravo's family and the public alike were furious with the findings, and the unsolved case dominated local news for weeks. Under intense pressure, a second coroner's inquest took place that summer. Florence testified for 3 days and found herself subjected to endless questions about her past affair with Dr. Gully, which Charles' family seemed to be determined to prove had continued into the marriage. But there was no evidence to tie Florence to the crime. The most likely source had been identified as Charles' water jug, which he drank from each night before bed. But Florence had not prepared any food or drink for him, had not administered any medication, and had not signed for any poison in her name. The second inquest failed to produce any new information, but concluded that Charles Bravo had been willfully murdered by an unknown person. There was not enough evidence to convict anyone of the crime, but plenty of theories exist about who may have been behind it. It may have been George Griffiths, the coachman Charles fired without notice. After his employment was terminated, Griffiths was overheard saying that Charles wouldn't live 5 months past the wedding, and he frequently used antimony in his work with the horses. But Griffiths had since gained new employment in Kent and had no access to the priory at the time of the death. If he was the poisoner, he would have needed help from another staff member, and it seems unlikely that he would go to such lengths to seek revenge on an old employer. Was it Dr. Gully, who was still in love with Florence and horrified at her mistreatment? Gully had access to the poison and often communicated with the staff of the priory, including Jane Cox. But he'd spent his life caring for others and was known to be kind. Murder seemed very out of character. Could it be Jane Cox, Florence's mysterious companion? She'd been the sole witness to hear Charles say he'd taken poison. She'd also ordered the maid to immediately clean the sick ball and bed sheets from Charles' room, destroying evidence. Jane was the public's favourite suspect for the crime, and during the second inquest, she attempted to shift the blame onto Florence by sharing everything she knew of her friend's affair with Gully. But Cox didn't have a personal motive to kill Charles Bravo. She disappeared after the inquest, having lost both her job and her closest friend. Was the killer Florence Bravo? She certainly had problems with her new husband, but she wasn't trapped, as she'd retained control of her own money. Above all, she craved respectability and acceptance. Becoming the widow of a murder victim did nothing for her reputation. Is it possible that Charles Bravo killed himself? It's known that he was unhappy with Florence's drinking, and antimony was sometimes used in small doses to treat alcoholism. Maybe Charles had secretly been dosing his wife's drinks, or perhaps he'd been using the antimony more liberally on purpose. There was no denying that Florence's health had grown increasingly worse in the final weeks of their marriage. During the 3 days he clung to life, Bravo never once pointed suspicion at anyone. And the night of the poisoning, he'd called for hot water immediately to induce vomiting, as if he was aware he'd ingested poison. Was it possible that Charles, angry after a day of falls, embarrassments and marital arguments, had hastily grabbed the wrong bottle and accidentally taken the poison? The vessel was never found, but the maid recalled the fire in Charles' room blazing uncommonly high. Perhaps he'd tossed the poison into the flames before calling for help. Admitting to the accidental poisoning during his death would expose his secret dosing of Florence and reveal a clumsy, fatal mistake. As a man who valued his own image above all else, it seems probable that he would protect it until the end. Though the question that remains unsolved is who poisoned Charles Bravo, this case would ultimately claim 2 lives. After the inquest, Florence was evicted from the priory and forced to change her name and relocate to Hampshire. Within 2 years, she too was dead, having drank herself to death with no friends or family to care for her. What slower, deadlier poison is there than a lifetime of abuse, tragedy, and loneliness? Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.